Hello, Matthew, and all of our mutual fans out there. This is Dr. Dave again to talk about my latest podcast interview, this time with Jungian analyst Dr. Samuel Kimbles. And Dr. Kimbles has been president of the San Francisco Jung Institute, and he also lives in my local area. And until recently, I didn't realize that he had been president of the San Francisco Jung Institute. So it was very good to have this opportunity to interview him. It's podcast number 425, and I've titled it The Unconscious Impact of Culture on Psyche. And so I think you'll want to check it out. Now, from Jung, you're familiar with the idea of the collective unconscious, and from both Freud and Jung, you're familiar with the idea of the personal unconscious. It's thanks to Joseph Henderson that we have writing and knowledge about the cultural unconscious. Well, Dr. Kimbles sharpens that concept somewhat in talking about and developing his theories around the group unconsciousness, if you will, that if one comes from a group defined by race or gender or political ideology or other sorts of things, then there is a kind of unconsciousness that's associated with that group and that can affect its outlook and its biases, its perceptions, etc. And Dr. Kimbles is especially well positioned to write about this, having grown up in Jackson, Mississippi as an African American himself. And he has a book that the interview is based on, and here's what it looks like. It's called Phantom Narratives, The Unseen Contributions of Culture to Psyche. So I highly recommend this podcast to you all. And back to you, Matthew. Hello again, Matthew. It's good to be back here with you once again. And boy, do I have a podcast interview to talk about this week. It's just perfect for your audience. I interviewed Dr. Bonnie Badenoch, who did a lot of training with Dr. Daniel Siegel, who I'm sure you and your audience will be very familiar with. And she has written this incredible book. She's actually written two incredible books. One is called Being a Brain-Wise Therapist, A Practical Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology. And it looks like this. And in fact, I have a link to it for sale on the Shrink Wrap Radio website. And she also has written a companion workbook called the Brain Savvy Therapist Workbook. And I am just blown away by this woman, by the mix of intelligence, her ability to integrate all of this new brain science material that's just been exploding, so much information coming out, and combining that with a very humane, humanistic, mindfulness-oriented, compassionate approach to psychotherapy. And so it's really quite a trick to bring those two forces together and to blend them, to bring in all of this objective science, all of the information that comes from the outside to us, and at the same time to bring all this sort of wisdom and knowledge of the subjective world, and to blend those two together so skillfully. It was a joy to interview her, and I'm sure that anybody who tunes into this will both learn a lot and will be inspired. And one of the things that impressed me was how, at a fairly late stage in her life, she has learned and integrated and digested all of this very, scientific information. There's a lot to learn out there. And she really has it under her belt. And this is where I think the education of clinical psychologists and other kinds of therapists is increasingly going to have to go. They've got your wonderful publication to turn to, and that's certainly one source, great source of education. But in her workbook, she's really created something that I think would be tremendously useful to therapists, perhaps to students in training as well, but even to seasoned therapists who feel like, wow, there's just so much of this information, but it's so technical. And how can I learn all of that technical information, and how can I integrate it into the work that I already do as a psychotherapist? And I think if a person were to read these two books and then particularly devote themselves to working through the workbook, which really has exercises and assignments and so on, as well as a lot of text, I think that would put them in very good stead. So listen to Shrink Wrap Radio number 424. Back to you, Matthew.